The large lobby of the city's most famous theater was buzzing with energy. It was the kind of place where the floors were so shiny you could see your reflection in them. And the air smelled like expensive flowers and strong coffee. It was a Friday night, and the biggest show of the year had just finished its first half. The audience was on a break. People were everywhere, walking in groups, holding glasses of wine, and laughing loudly. They were dressed in their finest clothes. The men wore dark suits with shiny shoes, and the women wore colorful dresses that sparkled under the bright lights. Everyone seemed to know someone, and the room was filled with the sound of voices catching up with friends. In the middle of this huge room, standing apart from the main stage where the orchestra played, was a piano. It was a grand piano, black and sleek. It looked like a very expensive piece of furniture. However, tonight it wasn't being treated like a musical instrument. It was just being used as a table. People had walked past it and carelessly placed their drinks on top of it. There were wine glasses, water bottles, and even a few small plates of cheese sitting on the polished surface. No one looked at it with respect. To the crowd, it was just a convenient place to put things down while they talked, while the rich and powerful guests enjoyed their break. A young man stood near the large glass entrance of the lobby. His name was not important to the people there, but he was different from everyone else. He was not wearing a suit that costs thousands of dollars. Instead, he wore a simple, faded jacket that looked like he had owned it for many years. Underneath, his shirt was clean but old, the collar slightly worn. His shoes were not the shiny leather kind the other men wore. They were simple work boots, tied tightly with a bit of dust on them from walking outside. He carried a heavy backpack over one shoulder, and he held on to the strap with a firm grip. The young man stood very still. He watched the people. He saw the way they laughed and the way they sipped their drinks. He didn't look jealous or angry. He just looked focused. His eyes were scanning the room, but they weren't looking at the people's faces or their expensive jewelry. He was looking at the piano. He watched it from across the room as if he was waiting for a signal. Every time someone walked past the piano and laughed loudly, a small frown would appear on his face, not because he hated them, but because he hated seeing the instrument ignored. This young man had not come to the theater for the show. He had not bought a ticket. In fact, he had been working all day at a construction site a few blocks away. He was tired. His hands, which were hidden in his pockets, were rough and covered in small calluses from lifting heavy materials and handling tools. His back ached from the long hours of labor. Most people in his position would have gone home to rest, but he had come here for a specific reason. He needed to hear a sound. He needed to feel the vibration of music under his fingers. He slowly took a few steps forward, moving out of the shadow of the entrance and into the bright light of the lobby. The noise of the crowd was overwhelming. It was a mix of high-pitched giggles, low booming laughs, and the clinking of glass. The air was warm and stuffy. As he walked closer to the center of the room, some people noticed him. A woman in a glittering silver dress turned to look at him. She saw his worn jacket and his dusty boots, and she quickly turned away, whispering something to the man next to her. The man glanced over and smirked, then looked back at his drink. They made a quick judgment. They assumed he was lost, or perhaps someone who had wandered in from the street by mistake. The young man saw them look at him, and he saw them turn away. He knew what they were thinking. It wasn't the first time he had been underestimated because of his clothes or his job. He lowered his head slightly, trying to make himself look smaller, and kept walking. He wasn't here to fight or to argue. He was here on a mission. He squeezed the strap of his backpack tighter and took a deep breath to calm his nerves. Finally, he reached the edge of the circle where the piano stood. Up close, the piano looked even more beautiful. It was massive, with a curve that seemed to go on forever. But seeing the drink sitting on top of it made his heart sink. He stood there for a moment, just a few feet away from the keys. He looked around, wondering if there was a guard or someone who owned the piano he could talk to. He saw waiters rushing around with trays of food. He saw guests taking photos of themselves, but no one seemed to be in charge of the music. He reached a hand into his pocket and pulled it out. His hand was large and the skin was hard and textured from years of work. The knuckles were scraped and there was a small bandage on his thumb. He flexed his fingers, opening and closing his hand. He knew that these hands were meant for building things, for pouring concrete and hammering nails. But he also knew a secret that the people laughing around him didn't know. These hands could also make music. The young man took another step closer. He was standing right next to the piano bench now. The noise of the crowd seemed to get louder, making him feel dizzy. He felt a bead of sweat run down the side of his face. He was terrified. He knew that if he asked, they might laugh. They might tell him to leave. They might call security. But the pull of the piano was too strong. He remembered the old broken piano he used to play in the community center when he was a child. He remembered how the music used to take him away from his problems. He needed that feeling again, even if it was just for 5 minutes. He looked around one last time to see who was nearby. There was a group of 3 men standing close to the piano, talking loudly about money and business. They didn't even notice him standing there. The young man took a shaky breath. He knew he couldn't just sit down and play without asking. That would be rude, and he was raised to be polite. He had to find someone to give him permission. He spotted a man who looked like he might be important. This man was standing by a pillar, holding a glass of champagne, looking very pleased with himself. He looked like he belonged in this world of luxury. The young man in the worn jacket hesitated. He wiped his sweaty palm on his pants. He felt his heart beating fast against his ribs like a drum. He knew this was a mistake. He knew he didn't belong here. But the keys were right there, calling to him. He couldn't just walk away. He adjusted his backpack strap, stood up as straight as he could, and walked toward the man by the pillar. The floor felt slippery under his boots, and he tried to walk softly so he wouldn't slip. The laughter of the crowd swirled around him, mixing with his anxious thoughts. He felt like an intruder in a palace of gold. He was just a construction worker with dirty boots and a dream, but he was going to ask. He was going to ask to play the old piano. The young man took a deep breath and stepped closer to the man standing by the pillar. This man was dressed in a tuxedo that fit him perfectly, with a shiny silk tie and a small flower pinned to his lapel. He looked every bit the part of a wealthy patron, enjoying a night out at the theater. He was busy laughing at a joke someone had made, holding his glass of champagne loosely in his hand. The young man in the worn jacket hesitated for just a second. He felt very small standing next to this man who seemed to radiate confidence and money. But the thought of the piano sitting just a few feet away gave him the courage to speak up. "Excuse me, sir," the young man said. His voice was quiet, a little raspy from not speaking much all day. It sounded different in this room full of high, polished laughter. It sounded rough and simple. The man in the tuxedo stopped laughing mid-sentence. He turned his head slowly, looking down his nose at the young man. He didn't answer right away. He just looked him up and down, his eyes scanning the dusty boots, the faded jacket, and the backpack strap that was digging into the young man's shoulder. The man's expression was not one of anger, but of mild annoyance, as if a fly had landed on his expensive dinner. "Yes." "What is it?" the man asked. His tone was cold and sharp. He didn't even try to hide the fact that he thought the young man didn't belong there. The young man shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He could feel the eyes of the people nearby, starting to turn toward them. "I was wondering if it might be possible," the young man started, stumbling a little over his words. "If it would be okay. If I could play the piano? Just for a few minutes." The man in the tuxedo stared at him as if he had just heard the most ridiculous thing in the world. He raised one eyebrow and let out a short, loud laugh. "Play the piano, you." He turned to look at his friends as if to share the joke with them. "This instrument is a very valuable antique, son. It's not a toy for tourists to bang on." "It wouldn't take long," the young man insisted gently. "I promise I would be careful." The man shook his head, taking a sip of his drink. "Not tonight. We are here for a cultural experience, not to listen to some street musician. Go find a park bench if you want to make noise." The rejection hurt, but the young man didn't turn away. He stood his ground. "I know I don't look like it," he said, his voice gaining a little strength. "But I used to play a long time ago. I really need to play something tonight, please. Just one song." By now, the conversation had caught the attention of the people standing nearby. The circle of guests began to widen. A woman in a bright red dress stopped talking on her phone to watch. A group of young men holding beers turned around to see what was happening. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted. It went from a friendly, busy gathering to something tenser. People sensed a conflict, and they wanted to see how it would play out. The man in the tuxedo seemed to enjoy the attention. He straightened his back and spoke louder, making sure everyone could hear him. "Look, my friend," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Look around you. Do you see anyone else carrying a dirty backpack? Do you see anyone else dressed like they just finished a shift on a road crew? This is a private event. You're clearly lost." A few people in the crowd chuckled. It was a nervous laughter at first, but it grew quickly as they felt safer in their group. They looked at the young man's clothes. They saw his rough hands. They judged him instantly. To them, he was an interruption. He was a blemish on their perfect, shiny evening. "Give it a rest, kid," someone shouted from the back of the group. "Get a job." "Yeah, go play on a cardboard box," another voice added. This one was louder and meaner. The laughter swelled. It wasn't just a few people anymore. It was a wave of sound rolling over the young man. They weren't laughing because something was funny. They were laughing to show their power. They were laughing because they thought they were better than him. The young man felt his face get hot. He knew they were staring at him. He knew they were making fun of him. He could see the sneers on their faces and the smug smiles. He felt a strong urge to just turn around, push through the glass doors, and run away. He wanted to go back to the quiet streets where no one knew him and no one cared what he wore. But then he looked at the piano again. The black surface of the instrument gleamed under the lights. It was sitting there, silent and waiting. The young man remembered why he had come inside. He had come for the music, not for the approval of these strangers. He realized that if he walked away now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. He would always wonder what if. He ignored the man in the tuxedo and stepped forward toward the piano bench. "I'm talking to you." The man in the tuxedo snapped, offended that he was being ignored. He reached out as if to grab the young man's arm, but he stopped short, perhaps not wanting to get dirty or cause a scene that might actually ruin his night. The young man didn't look at the rich man anymore. He kept his eyes on the keys. He walked the last few steps to the bench. The crowd grew quieter for a split second, surprised by his boldness, and then the jeering became even louder. "Don't touch that. He's going to break it." "Security? Where is security? Let him play." A drunk voice yelled sarcastically from the back. "Let's hear a joke. Play us a sad song on your little violin." The laughter was deafening now. It filled the entire lobby. The echoes bounced off the marble floors and the high ceiling. It felt like the whole world was laughing at him. The young man sat down on the bench. It felt firm and sturdy. He was so close to the keys now that he could smell the wood and the faint scent of wax polish. He gently took off his backpack and set it down on the floor beside him. He placed his hands on his knees for a moment. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest. It was beating so hard he thought it might break a rib. His hands were shaking a little. He looked down at them. They were big hands, the hands of a worker. The knuckles were swollen, and there was dried dirt under the fingernails. They looked out of place, hovering over the pristine white and black keys. A woman near the front giggled, covering her mouth with her hand. "Those aren't musicians' hands. Those are for digging ditches." More laughter. The young man closed his eyes for a brief second. He blocked out the noise. He blocked out the faces. He thought about the melody that had been stuck in his head for weeks. He thought about the feeling of the strings vibrating inside the wood. He thought about the one song he knew how to play that could express everything he was feeling, the loneliness, the hard work, the hope, and the pain. Slowly, lifted his hands from his knees. He hovered them over the keyboard. The crowd went quiet for just a moment, waiting to see if he would actually do it. They were leaning in, ready to mock the first bad note, ready to shout insults as soon as he made a mistake. The young man took a final deep breath. He felt the tension in his shoulders drop away. He stopped thinking about the people in the fancy clothes. He stopped thinking about the man in the tuxedo. The world narrowed down until there was nothing left but him and the instrument. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask for permission again. He simply lowered his hands and pressed his fingers down on the keys. As his fingers made contact with the ivory keys, the air in the room seemed to shift instantly. The people who were leaning forward, smirks planted firmly on their faces, were expecting a disaster. They were ready to hear a clumsy bang, a sour note, or a childish tune that would confirm their belief that he didn't belong. They were waiting for the punchline to the joke. They thought they were watching. But what came out of the piano was not a disaster. The young man pressed down on 3 notes a deep, resonant C minor chord. The sound was not clumsy or thin. It was full, rich, and incredibly loud. It seemed to cut through the thick air of the lobby like a sharp knife through warm butter. The sound was so powerful that it vibrated right through the floorboards and up the legs of the people standing nearby. For a split second, the laughter didn't stop. It hung in the air like a bubble that hadn't burst yet. But as the sound of the chord rang out, echoing off the high ceiling, the jeers and giggles began to choke and die. It was as if the music itself physically pushed the noise back into their throats. The contrast was shocking. Here was this man in dirty work clothes, looking like he had just walked off a construction site, producing a sound that was cleaner and more beautiful than anything the orchestra had played. Earlier, the young man didn't stop. He didn't look around to see if they were watching. He didn't pause to soak up the sudden silence. His hands, which had been shaking just moments ago, were suddenly rock steady. He moved his left hand down the keyboard, playing a rolling bass line that was dark and heavy. It sounded like thunder rolling in the distance, or the heartbeat of a giant. Then, his right hand began to move. He started playing a melody that was complex and fast. It wasn't a simple pop song or a nursery rhyme. It was a piece that required incredible skill. His fingers danced across the keys, moving with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing to watch. He hit notes high up on the register that were sharp and bright, like piercing needles of sound, and then instantly dove back down to the low. Rumbling notes, the crowd was frozen. A woman in the front row, who had been holding her champagne glass loosely, nearly dropped it. Her mouth fell open slightly, the glass forgotten in her hand. The man in the tuxedo, who had been so confident and rude just a minute ago, stood rooted to the spot. His drink was held suspended in midair. He stared at the young man's back, his eyes wide. He couldn't understand what was happening. The person sitting on that bench was not the bumbling idiot he had imagined. The music continued to grow. It was not just technically impressive. It was filled with a raw, intense emotion that you couldn't fake. The young man was pouring his entire life into the keys. Every hour he had spent working in the cold, every time he had been ignored or looked down upon, every lonely night he had spent dreaming, it was all coming out through his fingertips. The piano was singing his pain. The melody was sad, but it was also strong. It had a driving rhythm that made you want to hold your breath. It sounded like a story of struggle and survival. The sound filled every corner of the huge lobby. It bounced off the marble walls and the glass windows. Wrapping around the people until they felt surrounded by it, people stopped checking their phones. The woman who had been recording a video to mock him lowered her arms slowly. She didn't press stop, but she wasn't laughing anymore. She was watching the screen, mesmerized by the blur of the young man's hands. The waiters stopped carrying trays. They stood still in the corners of the room, watching the scene unfold. Even the security guards, who had started to walk over to remove the young man, stopped in their tracks. They looked at each other, shrugged, and decided to wait. The young man's face was a picture of focus. He was sweating now, beads of perspiration rolling down his temples. His eyes were closed tight, as if he were seeing the music in colors behind his eyelids. He swayed slightly with the rhythm, his body moving with the instrument. He looked like he had been transported to a different world, a place where there were no fancy clothes, no rude comments, and no judgment. There was only him and the music. He played a run of notes that was so fast it sounded like a waterfall of sound. The intricate pattern wove together perfectly, without a single mistake. The people in the crowd began to realize that this was no amateur. This was someone who had dedicated years of his life to mastering this instrument. The rough hands that everyone had mocked were now flying across the keys with the grace of a butterfly, the power of a sledgehammer. The music changed dynamics. It suddenly became soft, delicate, and whisper quiet. The young man played a gentle, haunting tune that was so fragile it felt like the room needed to be silent to hear it. The crowd leaned in unconsciously. The bustling lobby, usually filled with the sound of chatter, was now as quiet as a library. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic breathing of 50 people and the beautiful, sorrowful melody drifting from the piano. In that moment, the social barriers that divided the room seemed to dissolve. The rich people in the expensive gowns and the young man in the worn jacket were connected by the sound. The music didn't care about money. It didn't care about status. It was just pure, honest emotion. A man in the back, who had been laughing the loudest, took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked tired suddenly, moved by the sound in a way he hadn't expected. The young man hit a deep, low chord that seemed to vibrate in everyone's chest. It was the kind of sound that you feel in your bones as much as you hear it with your ears. He held the chord, letting the notes hang in the air, trembling slightly with sustain. The sound was heavy with grief. It spoke of loss and longing. It was the sound of a man carrying a heavy load, yet refusing to put it down. The audience was completely captivated. They were no longer seeing a dirty intruder. They were seeing a master at work. The arrogance had drained out of the room, replaced by a profound sense of awe. The young man had taken their mockery and used it as fuel to create something extraordinary. He had turned a moment of humiliation into a moment of triumph, without saying a single word, as the melody began to build up again. Climbing toward a climax, the tension in the room rose with it. Everyone felt it. They were on a journey and they didn't know where it was going, but they knew they couldn't look away. The young man's fingers were a blur again, striking the keys with force and passion. The music swelled, filling the vast space until it felt like the walls might burst. The beauty of it was almost painful. He wasn't just playing notes. He was telling a story. And for the first time that night, the crowd was actually listening. They weren't just hearing noise. They were listening to the voice of a person they had tried to silence. And the voice was louder and more powerful than anything they had ever heard. The piano, which had been nothing more than a table for their drinks 5 minutes ago, was now the most important object in the world. It was alive, and it was speaking the truth. The young man's hands moved faster than ever, diving into the most difficult part of the song. The melody was no longer just sad. It had turned into a storm of sound. His fingers struck the keys with a force that was surprising, making the piano roar like a lion. The music was chaotic and beautiful, full of sharp turns and sudden stops. It sounded like a battle was taking place right there on the keyboard, up close. You could see the physical effort he was putting into it. The muscles in his forearms flexed and tightened under his sleeves. He leaned into the piano, almost attacking the keys, but with total control. His rough hands, which looked so out of place in this fancy theater, were now doing things that most people could only dream of. He was making the huge instrument sing with a voice that was desperate and urgent. The people watching were completely transfixed. The woman in the red dress had let her handbag slip off her shoulder and fall to the floor, but she didn't even notice. Her eyes were glued to the young man's hands. She was trying to understand how someone who looked like a laborer could possess such magic. The man in the tuxedo had set his champagne glass down on a nearby table because his hand was shaking too much to hold it steady. His face had lost its color. The sneer was gone, replaced by a look of pure shock and confusion. He realized he had made a terrible mistake, but he was too stunned to move. The music began to slow down. The young man brought the volume down from a loud roar to a soft whisper. He played a series of high, gentle notes that tinkled like falling rain, drops gentle, sad, and lonely. It was the kind of sound that makes you remember old memories you thought you had forgotten. People in the crowd started to feel a lump in their throats. It wasn't just a song anymore. It was a story being told without words. It felt like he was playing his life story for them. The hard work, the loneliness, the dreams that were crushed, the hope that somehow survived. A young couple standing near the back held hands tighter. The husband looked at his wife and saw a single tear rolling down her cheek. He didn't laugh. He just squeezed her hand. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely. Just minutes ago, it had been a place of judgment and arrogance. Now, it was a place of humility. The music had stripped away all the fancy clothes, the money, and the social status. It left everyone bare and equal. They were all just humans listening to another human pour his heart out. The young man hit a deep, resonating chord that seemed to hang in the air forever. He held it, letting the vibration fade into silence. But he didn't take his hands off the keys yet. He sat there for a moment, his head bowed low. His chest was heaving up and down as he caught his breath. You could see the sweat soaking through the back of his old jacket. He looked exhausted, as if he had just run a marathon. When he finally lifted his hands off the keys and placed them on his lap, the lobby did not erupt into noise immediately. There was a heavy, thick silence that stretched out. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a respectful one. It was the kind of silence you hear when something truly profound has happened, and no one wants to be the first to break it. The air in the room felt different. It felt cleared out, washed clean by the music. 10 seconds passed, then 15. The young man sat still, staring at the piano keys, perhaps afraid to turn around and see the faces of the people who had laughed at him. He didn't know if they were still laughing or if they were angry. He just sat there, looking small and vulnerable on the big bench. Then a sound broke the silence. It was the slow clap of one person. An elderly man who was standing near the back, leaning on a cane, started to clap. He clapped slowly with purpose. He looked at the young man with a look of deep respect and admiration. He didn't see a dirty worker. He saw a master artist. That single clap acted like a spark in a dry forest. Suddenly, the room exploded. It wasn't just polite clapping like before. It was a wave of loud, thunderous applause. People started cheering and whistling. The man in the tuxedo began to clap, looking at his shoes, feeling ashamed. The woman in the red dress wiped her eyes and clapped so hard her hands hurt. The waiters and security guards joined in, banging their trays or clapping along. The noise was overwhelming, but this time it wasn't mocking. It was pure appreciation. The young man flinched slightly at the sudden noise. He slowly turned around on the bench to look at the crowd. His eyes were wide, filled with surprise. He had expected rejection, but he was receiving love. The crowd was smiling at him now. No one was looking at his dirty boots or his worn backpack. They were looking at his face. They saw the humanity in him. They realized that you cannot judge a book by its cover. The rich and powerful guest had learned a lesson that night that money cannot buy talent. And fancy clothes do not make a person better than someone else. He sat there for a moment, soaking it in. He gave a shy, nervous smile. It was a genuine smile that reached his eyes. He nodded his head slightly, a small gesture of thanks to the audience. He didn't stand up and take a bow like a celebrity. He didn't shout or celebrate. He just accepted the applause with a humble grace that made everyone respect him even more. After a few moments, he reached down to the floor and picked up his backpack. He swung it over his shoulder, the strap once again digging into his shirt. He stood up from the piano bench. As soon as he stood, the applause seemed to get louder. With some people standing up from their tables to give him a standing ovation, the young man looked at the piano one last time. He gently ran his hand over the smooth wood of the body, as if saying goodbye to an old friend. He had done what he came to do. He had cleared his heart and shared his soul. He turned away from the center of the room. He didn't walk toward the bar or the guests to shake hands. He didn't try to network or ask for a job. He just walked toward the large glass exit doors. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. They stepped aside to make a clear path for him. Watching him in silence now, the clapping fading down as he moved, the man in the tuxedo stepped forward, opening his mouth as if he wanted to say something, maybe an apology or maybe an offer to buy him a drink. But the young man didn't stop. He just kept walking, his eyes fixed on the exit. He didn't want anything from them. He didn't need their validation anymore. He had proven his worth to himself, and that was enough. As he reached the glass doors, he pushed the bar to open them. The cool night air rushed in to meet him. He stepped out of the bright, warm lobby and into the darkness of the street. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind him, separating him from the world of wealth and privilege. Inside, the room felt different. The piano stood empty again, looking majestic and beautiful in the center of the floor. No one put a drink coaster on it. No one leaned on it to chat. It sat there as a monument to the young man who had played it. The guests stood around for a long time, talking in hushed voices. They weren't discussing business or gossip anymore. They were talking about the music. They were talking about the young man who had humbled them all. Outside, the young man walked down the street. He took a deep breath of the fresh air. He felt lighter than he had in years. The heavy burden he had been carrying was gone. He looked up at the stars and smiled to himself. He didn't know where he was going to sleep that night, and he didn't know if he would ever eat at a fancy restaurant. But for the first time in a long time, he felt proud. He walked on into the night, his footsteps echoing on the pavement, leaving the grand theater behind him, but taking the music with him in his heart. The automatic glass doors slid shut with a soft hiss, sealing the young man back into the night. The sound of the applause, which had been so loud and thunderous just moments before, was suddenly cut off. It was as if he had stepped out of one world and into another entirely. Inside, there was warmth, bright lights, and the lingering echo of his music. Outside, it was just the regular city night cool, a bit damp and dark. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The streetlights were humming a low, monotonous buzz, very different from the melody he had just created. Cars drove past on the street, their tires making a whooshing sound on the pavement. A taxi honked its horn somewhere down the block. The city was moving on, completely unaware that a miracle had just happened inside that fancy building. The young man took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cold air. He could still feel the vibration of the piano keys in his fingertips. It was a tingling sensation, like pins and needles, but it felt good. It felt electric. He looked down at his hands. They were still the same rough, calloused hands he had walked in with. They were still dirty from a hard day's work. But to him, they felt different. They didn't feel like hands that just carried heavy stones or mixed cement. They felt like hands that could create something beautiful. He clenched them into fists and then opened them again, smiling at the memory of the music. He pulled the straps of his backpack tighter, shifting the weight on his shoulders. He didn't have a destination in mind. He didn't have a fancy hotel room to go to, and he didn't have a car waiting for him. He just needed to walk. He needed to move his legs to process everything that had just happened. As he walked away from the theater, passed by the large windows again, he couldn't help but glance inside. Through the reflection of the streetlights and the glass, he could see the lobby. The people were still there. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't checking their watches or looking bored. They were standing in small groups, talking quietly. Some of them were standing near the piano, looking at it with a new sense of respect. It made him feel warm inside to know that he had changed the mood in that room. Even if just for a little while, he kept walking, his boots clicking against the concrete. He passed by expensive restaurants where people were sitting at tables outside, eating gourmet meals and laughing. He walked past shops that were closed for the night, their mannequins staring blankly out into the street. He felt invisible again, just a shadow moving through the city. But strangely, he didn't mind being invisible. The people inside the theater had seen him. They had really seen him, and that was enough. A few blocks away, the city changed. The bright lights of the theater district faded, replaced by the dimmer, harsher glow of the working-class neighborhood. The buildings here were older, the bricks stained with soot. There were no doormen waiting to open doors here. There were just piles of garbage bags waiting for morning collection and the occasional stray cat digging for food. The young man stopped at a small convenience store on the corner. The fluorescent light inside flickered with a buzzing noise. He walked in, the bell above the door dinging sharply. The clerk, an older man who looked tired and bored, was sitting behind the counter reading a newspaper. He looked up over his glasses, saw the young man's worn jacket, and immediately looked back down, indifferent. The young man went to the cooler at the back and pulled out a bottle of water. It was cheap, the coldest thing they had. He paid for it with a few crumpled bills from his pocket and walked back out. He stood on the corner for a while, sipping the water. It was cold and refreshing. He leaned against the brick wall of the store and closed his eyes. He replayed the night in his head. He remembered the fear he felt when he first walked in. the humiliation when they laughed, and then the incredible release when he started to play. He realized that he had been carrying a heavy weight on his shoulders for a long time. It's the weight of feeling like he wasn't good enough, like he didn't matter because he wasn't rich. But tonight that weight was gone. He realized that dignity doesn't come from the clothes you wear or the job you have. It comes from what is inside you. It comes from your ability to touch someone else's soul. He had touched the souls of those rich, important people. For a few minutes, he was the most important person in the world to them. A car drove by, with the radio turned up loud. A catchy pop song was blasting out of the open windows. It was a simple, happy tune. The young man listened to it and tapped his foot against the sidewalk. He appreciated the music for what it was. Not every song had to be a sad, complex masterpiece. Sometimes, a simple beat was exactly what you needed. He finished his water and crushed the plastic bottle in his hand. He looked for a trash can and threw it in. He didn't litter. He took care of his city, just like he took care of his work. He started walking again, heading toward the old neighborhood where he lived. It was a long walk, maybe an hour or more, but he didn't mind. He had a lot to think about. He thought about his job at the construction site. He would have to be back there at sunrise. It would be hard work. His back would hurt, and his hands would get dirty again. But now, he knew that there was more to his life than just that work. He had a secret escape. He had the music. He wondered if he would ever play a piano like that again. Maybe he would. Maybe he would save up some money and buy a cheap, broken keyboard to practice on. Or maybe he would just keep playing in his head. It didn't matter. The experience was his now. Nobody could take that away from him. As he walked, the city seemed to look different to him. Usually, he just saw the grime and the struggle. He saw the things he couldn't afford. But tonight, he saw the beauty in the ordinary. He saw the way the streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, making it look like a black river of gold. He heard the rhythm of the traffic lights changing click, click, click. It sounded like a metronome. The whole city was a song, and he was finally listening to it, eventually. He reached the old brick building where he rented a small room. It wasn't much. The stairs were creaky, and the hallway smelled like cooking grease and old onions. He climbed the stairs slowly, his legs tired from the long walk and the emotional night. He reached his door, fished his key out of his pocket, and unlocked it. He stepped inside and flipped the light switch. A single bare bulb lit up the small room. There was a bed, a small table, and a chair. It was empty and simple. It was a million miles away from the grand lobby he had just left. He threw his backpack on the chair and sat down on the edge of the bed. He looked at his hands again. They were resting on his knees. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He didn't need the grand piano to feel the music anymore. He could hear it in his mind, clear and pure. He hummed a few bars of the melody he had played softly under his breath. The notes hung in the quiet air of his small room, making it feel less empty. The young man lay back on his bed, staring up at the cracks in the ceiling. He felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. He knew that tomorrow the sun would rise, and he would still be a worker. He would still be just a regular guy to the world. But that was okay. Because he knew the truth, he knew that inside his rough, dirty exterior was a soul capable of creating magic. And that was a treasure that no amount of money could buy. He closed his eyes. And for the first time in a long time, he fell asleep instantly, dreaming of melodies and black and white keys, floating through the night like a ghost made of music. The city outside kept making its noise, but inside that small room, everything was perfectly silent and perfectly beautiful.